So now I'm going to be talking about complexity and disintegration in networks. As we go around and talk to lots of people in this field of work, they often tell us, you know, it's not working with the clients that's hard. In fact, I love working with the clients. It's working with all those other workers and different agencies that gather around young people or clients that's really, really difficult. We sometimes say multi-agency networking isn't rocket science. It's much harder than that. So complexity, really the client group that AMBIT is geared towards are those people who are experiencing multiple problems at the same time in multiple domains of their functioning. So it might be that, you know, in the domain of their mental health, they are experiencing some low mood. They might have some difficult histories of abuse and neglect. They're also using substances. They're on the edge of or experiencing sexual exploitation. They might be involved in gangs. And of course, these problems don't order themselves neatly. They kind of interact in an interwoven way that gets really complicated. So it's not usually possible to say, well, their primary problem is their mental health and everything else is kind of an offshoot of that. But actually everything makes each other a bit worse. So maybe I've got a really difficult family background that's made my mood quite low, and I use cannabis as just kind of the one thing that helps me get by sometimes. But to fund that cannabis use, I've kind of got involved with a gang who are starting to exploit me, perhaps sexually, perhaps in terms of dealing. That's getting me in trouble with the law. I'm also, you know, struggling in terms of money and housing. And so it's really difficult to know where to begin to help someone who's got all of these different problems. And what we know is that when there is this kind of complexity, that long-term outcome doesn't look that great. So if you remember that each quadrant of the wheel has these two principled stance features that are kind of in tension with one another. Because of the complexity that we're talking about, it's kind of obvious that we would say, well, you must try to work or intervene in multiple domains. It's no good just working in silos saying, well, my bit of this person is their mental health and I'm going to think about that to the exclusion of everything. Or that, well, I'm just a housing worker, you know, I don't care if they tell me they're also using substances. Actually, we do have to, you know, if we're going to help people with complex problems, we've got to work out a way to start to chip away at all the different problems that are going on. Now, what that means is that often lots of different services get involved. And when they do get involved, then sometimes some problems come up. We're not quite sure out of this rabble of workers who should do what. Sometimes we don't agree about what the main problem is, and that leads to concerns about working out actually what should we do and where should we start. You know, do we try and take one bit at a time, or do we find some kind of more scheduled way of saying, well, if we do a bit of work around this first, then maybe, you know, as this person's mood starts to get better, then maybe we can start to think about their substance use. But we might not agree about that order. And each different discipline or service that gets involved probably has different priorities, different things that get them up in the morning. If I'm a teacher, I've spent lots of time learning about just how crucial somebody's education is to their kind of later life chances. Equally, if I work for CAMS, I know how important somebody's mental health is, and that actually it's quite hard to go to school if my mental health isn't that great. So we might argue about whether it's okay for a young person to come out of school and all that they miss in doing that just to have some mental health treatment. We certainly in different disciplines and services speak a different language. We have lots of jargon that we use even when we try not to, and it's confusing. Sometimes we don't understand each other, so it's hard to know how our clients might understand us. We have different theoretical frameworks, different ways of understanding what problems are and how they come about, and certainly different ways of and approaches for treating or helping those problems. We have different ways that we work. One service might have a very relaxed attitude to using text messaging and maybe even Facebook for communicating with young people. For another service, that might seem very unboundaried and not the way that they do things. And of course, those might be two services that are seeing the same client. So what we think this creates is, and we use the term disintegration, that networks become disintegrated. And that's not a criticism of the status quo. We'd say it's inevitable. When you've got lots and lots of people involved that come from different backgrounds, things will get disintegrated. And 99.9% of the time, you know, our efforts are well-intentioned. There's a few bits of poor practice out there, but most of us don't go into work each day going, oh, I think I'll try and really mess up this person's system of care. We're all trying to do our bit to the best of our ability in an attempt to help the client as much as we can. But sometimes when we all do that at once and we create this disintegration, at best we can create an experience of care for clients that's confusing, baffling, maybe quite frustrating. At worst, actually, we can create quite an unpleasant experience of help that sometimes makes things worse, not better, or can lead clients to say, do you know what, just forget the lot of you, professional help isn't helpful, it's just confusing and frustrating. So therefore, the other stance that's kind of in tension with this idea of working in multiple domains is this idea of needing to address disintegration and trying to support integration within networks. And we're going to have some other video talking about how workers might start to do that, whoever they are within the professional network, whether they've sort of got a role as lead professional that might help them to do that a little bit. So where does this disintegration come from? It's just helpful to think about some of the processes that go on that contribute to it. So there's definitely can be conflict between services or conflict between different disciplines, some of which is quite historical and we can't quite remember why we don't like that service very much, but we don't like them and we think we're the better service. Sometimes it's much more explicit than that actually right now we're directly competing for a particular bid for a new service. So we're kind of competitors, even though we're trying to collaborate around this particular client. Sometimes there's age-old rivalries between services. Certainly we can believe that kind of we're the protectors of this client and we sort of need to protect them from all the other awful services out there. There can be policy contradictions that, you know, at one team's whole reason for being, what they're measured against, what they're paid to do is to keep young people out of care. You might have another service working with a young person who's thinking, do you know what? It's not that great, but it might be that the best thing for them right now would be to go into care. And therefore, you've kind of got this contradiction. We have different financial constraints, which can make it really difficult for us to work well together. And then finally, and we think this one's really important and definitely something that we can do something about, both as individuals, services, and networks, are these false beliefs or mythologies that arise about other services. There's lots of reasons that those come about. One is that we get biased feedback about other services from our clients. It's pretty rare that a young person comes to me and says, oh Liz, there was a police officer that just came over to check I was okay when I was having an argument with my boyfriend and he made me feel really safe. Those things might happen, but we don't tend to hear them. What we tend to hear about is, oh, the police stopped and searched me again. They're all nasty. You know, my social worker's done this again. And what I know for myself is really tempting when a young person says to me, I find you so much easier to talk to than my social worker. My social worker doesn't get it. They're just constantly trying to take my allowance away. It's very tempting for me to feel, oh yes, I'm the best worker, and to say, God, yes, that social worker, that sounds awful. I'll go and have a word with them. And of course, it's important to advocate for our clients when we hear about practice that isn't that great. But actually, it's very easy for us to make assumptions about that social worker's behaviour. Actually, you know, the social worker may have had very good reasons for what they did. So it's kind of more helpful in terms of the young person's engagement with help if we can maybe say we'll go away and, you know, would it be helpful if I went away and had a think with the social worker? But actually to engage the client in a conversation about how do we make sense of why you sometimes get into these interactions with your social worker? Where do you think they're coming from that would make sense of their behaviour? Because my experience of them is they do want to help you. So let's try and work it out. So we're going to have some other videos introducing some ways of starting to address this disintegration, including something we call the disintegration grid.